can.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to PANRG. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Good, good. I had to go and put some headphones on because I've noticed Meet Echo is a little bit less forgiving with feedback. So usually I do the whole thing with speakers and everything because I'm in meetings all day and very much. I mean, I guess we're all in meetings all day, even during not an IETF meeting. So welcome to the Matrix. This is the Pathware Networking Research Group. Today is the 11th of November. I hope you're in the right place. Actually, of course, you're in the right place. Everyone should be here in the PANRG Pathware Networking Research Group. So on the agenda today, we have, sort of like the note well, and a little bit of a review of the IAB review. This is the IRTF note well. Notice this is the IRTF, not the IETF, although the IRTF does follow the IETF intellectual property rights disclosure rules. It is Thursday. I am assuming that most of you have already seen this by now, but if not, here it is. If you don't know what this is, please read and understand it. So for participants, keep your audio and video off unless you are speaking. It is recommended to wear headphones. You can see I just got some. That recommendation is indeed worth following. To speak, please join the queue at your turn. Then send audio and video. I don't know if you do. There's like different versions of this. I know for RIPE, if you click on video, so the next version of Meet Echo, if you click on video, it'll automatically turn on audio, which will be nice for IETF113. Leave the queue and done. And yeah, if you can't hear us, turn off your VPN. There have apparently been some VPN problems. All of the slides have been added to the Meet Echo, so you can actually share preloaded slides. Use that button and pick your presentation when you are a presenter. Wanted minutes taker. I think we actually have a minutes taker. Thank you very much, Gory. Here's our agenda. I'm going to ramble on for a few minutes about the IAB review. Then we will have Reese and Cyril talking about a vocabulary of path properties. Nicholas on satellite networks. Spencer to talk about some multipath selection strategies. And then we have a bit of open mic time, which I think we've never had before. We generally have scheduled these things to be short, and then we get an agenda that is very long, and we have to tell people, I'm sorry, there's not enough time. And this time we decided we're going to fix that by having an agenda that is long. And we have some open mic time, so anything that comes up, from the IAB review stuff or, discussion of multipath or whatever, we have that time to discuss there.
Yeah, and I think I made a mistake, and we actually have 40 minutes for open mic, not 10.
Oh, so yes, indeed.
Just ignore this, yes.
Yes. Good. So what's going on? The IRTF PANRG questions draft is, I think, waiting on the document shepherd. As I recall, we were going to triple check whether Stephen was okay with the outcome of the discussion off the IESG conflict review. We are also, I believe, waiting on me to take one last bit of feedback from Gory together with some feedback that's already in GitHub and roll a new draft version, which I guess I can do today during the open mic. Yeah, so we do have the IRTF PANRG path properties, an active research group document. We will talk about that. That is the next presentation. And then we have, since the last meeting, had an IAB review of the research group on that. See next slide. What happened to the slide?
No, me.
Ah,
Me.
There we go. Got it. All right. So, occasionally let me see if there's any IAB members in the room. Hi, Miria. Occasionally the IAB will review research groups to make sure, one, that they're sort of in line with other things that are happening in the architecture, happening in the IRSG, or the IRTF or in the IETF. We did this review I think September and October with the IB, and we had coming out of that a set of next steps, like what we think we should do as a research group. So one is continue answering the questions, right? Like, so the path properties draft is a very good answer to, I believe, the first question in the PANRG questions doc. We have 8 others. We are seeking sort of input, discussion, anything else that addresses any of those particular questions, right? Like, so I think this is a relatively open-ended area for discussion. We should also consider sort of the other direction. So considering research, like taking things and moving them back into the IETF. So the research applications of PAN properties to IETF protocols. So a good example here is Spencer. We'll be talking about the multipath selection strategies work later. There remains some overlap between PAN and Alto. There is, I think, some more research-oriented follow-up work from Alto's recharter. We have reached out to them to invite them to come to PANRG and consider continuing that work here. And I think that one of the big bits of value that we as a research group provide is operating as a general venue in the IETF space. So the IRTF, and we're exploiting that adjacency to the IETF to be a good place to talk about the intersections between routing and transport through the internet layer. And so these discussions have come up time and time again, sort of in the IETF, and there's like a lot of feedback. Hey, this looks more like a research question. We're there as a venue to discuss that. If there are other things that you think that we should be doing, or if you think that we should not be doing any of these things, we have 40 minutes of open mic time to discuss that after the rest of today's agenda. Moving on.
I think it's the last slide. So
yes. Oh yeah, moving on. So then the next presenter, either Reese or Cyril, coming up.
Yes, I am about to request sharing slides. At least that's what I clicked. But it's not coming. Oh, here we go. Vocabulary of properties. Yeah. Okay. Hi, folks. This is Reese. I go by Teresa on my publications, so that's what's showing up on the slide. And I'll be talking about the vocabulary of path properties draft. We updated this draft prior to IETF112 with 2 significant changes. First change is we revised the entity definition as we got feedback that our previous definition was too generic. So now we verbalize what do all entities as used in this document have in common. And they have in common that they play a role related to path-aware networking for particular paths and flows. And what role can this be? For example, it can relate to data plane or control plane functionality is one way to think about it. And those 2 terms are also worth defining. So we took a step by saying data plane means the entity participates in forwarding of flows across paths. And control plane means the entity influences aspects of how forwarding happens. And in that case, if the entity influences forwarding, it usually is aware of path properties to inform its decisions. And I guess critically, an entity can be broader. It can be on path or off the path, but if it's a node, it is an on path entity. Second significant change is that we made the transparency definition more formal, modeling it as a function f. And the inputs to this function are a flow capital F and some meta information M. And the output of the function is an action A taken by a node. So if the output of F is constant, regardless of the input value M, then the node is transparent. Or in other words, if A is not impacted by M, the node is transparent to the flow F with respect to the meta information M. For example, if A, the action is always constant given arbitrary M, then that is transparent. So this allows one to formally prove transparency by proving that the function's output does not change if one wanted to do so. And one can even do a formal taint analysis, which is something that was brought up in the chat during the last session. We could show that M, the meta information, does not taint or impact the output of F to define transparency. And now moving forward, and this is already my last slide, we have now had multiple instances, I think, of the research group wanting to publish other documents and then getting feedback or getting questions about about some terms in those other documents that were not well defined. For example, what is a path? What is control plane? And this led to asking if we can define those terms in this document in the vocabulary of path properties. And yeah, I guess for the documents that we are publishing or have published so far, those sort of precede the path properties draft, so it's hard to depend on the path properties draft. But I think with especially with documents that are sort of still in progress in the working group, there is a good opportunity to define key terms that are used in other path properties drafts. So we actually had a question about a routing domain identifier, which I think is going to be used in the next iteration of the questions draft, but it's not yet defined in the path properties draft, but maybe we want to define it in here. And then maybe there's also more terms that we need to define. So I was curious, what does the research group think? What terms merit defining in this path properties document? And also, in more generally, how can this document be useful to the research group?
Sorry, I had a headphone failure, so I had to go fix the thing. Spencer.
Yeah, thank you all for your continued work on this draft, and I'm finding it more and more helpful as we go along. So two things. One, I put in the issue about the routing domain identifier term, but I noticed that I noticed that the draft itself did not have a pointer to the GitHub repo. So I also put in an issue for that. If that could happen, I'm finding that to be, as predicted, very helpful for getting input from more people than I was getting on things before I put things in GitHub repos. So that would be awesome. And thank you for looking at the routing domain identifier. I had so defining terms that are used in other PANRG drafts, I think is a really good exercise. The one caution I would give is I was using there's a lot of terminology in the impediments to deployment RFC that was terminology from the time, and so I don't think that especially the contribution section of that draft is especially good for that. But more broadly, if there's anything else that comes up that we look at that's in PathRG questions, adding, and doesn't have an obvious widely understood meaning, those would be awesome to add. But but let me stop there because I'm mostly talking to the first bullet. Let me let people talk to the other bullets, and thank you.
Sure, thanks. And I will absolutely be adding a pointer to the GitHub repository.
So I guess I will add myself to the queue as an individual, and try to address the second question, because sort of I've come to realize that sort of the exercise of this document is to do a recursive traversal of the space of vocabulary that you need to understand what the properties of a path are, right? Like, so it's like, okay, we define this, and then we define this, and then we define this. In terms of this, we need to know what control plane is. We need to know what data plane is. The problem, there's a very clear boundary between things that you need to define and things that you don't when you're, depth first traversing all of language, right? Like, you're not going to get to the bottom. And I'm trying to think of a good sort of like way to know that you can stop. And one way to know that you can stop is when you can reference some other existing definition of something, right? Like, so, I think there's probably some terminology around transport protocols or around network layer protocols that are in the referencing documents there. I think we should be cautious about trying to, define what is a node or what is an endpoint, or these things that are sort of like used in many places as shorthand for the thing that we care about, right? Like, so and then have in multiple contexts different definitions, right? Like, so I very much like the precision that we have of sort of on that definition of transparency, right? Like, that I think is the right level of definition here. But where we go in sort of like the broad scope, I don't have a good metric for knowing when we're done. So I would probably advise to fall back on the metric that we use in the rest of the IETF, which is work on it until you arbitrarily think you're done, and then call for last call, and then people will come out of the woodwork, and then work on the last call comments. I apologize that I cannot do better than that, but I will stop talking because someone else is in queue. Sabine. Sabine, you can go ahead and ask to turn on audio/video. Here we go.
Now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. So thanks for this work, and sorry I did not read the last version. But regarding the point that was raised by Brian, for example, if you take the definition of an endpoint, and yes, indeed, many of these definitions may have different meanings, and also you can just circle around with the definition. Did you consider making some of the definitions relative to context? For example, an endpoint in routing may not be the same thing as an endpoint in transport, and yet another thing than an endpoint for flows or for application. So in general, in the definitions, did you consider adding like some maybe not multi-dimensionality, but just a point saying, okay, there are different scopes relative to which we can provide a definition?
Yeah, so in the current draft, we have a in the introduction, we are saying that some of these terms have been used with different meanings in different areas of networking, for example, in routing and in transport. Folks might understand what a path is differently, and this document attempts to provide a common definition to define paths, path elements, and flows, so we can talk about them in PANRG. So the document is not trying to define it for everybody what they need to understand path is, but it's sort of the scope is discussions in PANRG and potentially drafts in PANRG that reference back to this terminology draft. And I think then the terminology or definitions themselves are intended to be general enough that basically a node in a transport sense or a routing sense, they could both be nodes, right? So there is sort of some flexibility here, but the document doesn't attempt to neatly define that a node in a routing sense has to be this and a node in a transport sense has to be that.
Okay. So again, so you don't think it would be helpful, for example, for each of, maybe not all of them, but for a number of these definitions, try to explicitly gather the given context with respect to which you define a thing. For example, if I get back to that example of endpoints, and for other, just explicitly say, gather, see here is what, here are the different contexts, standardized or not, with respect to which there exists a stable definition of this thing.
Right, so the document doesn't define endpoint right now, but it does define host. But I'm wondering if maybe it would make sense to add an endpoint definition and then basically say it can mean these different kinds of things. But I would also be curious if other people agree that that is useful.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Spencer.
Down to the second bullet. I guess one of the things I was thinking about there was that two things. One is what we did with the questions draft was to say these are the questions that we think are research questions now. Right. So that was a checkpoint. And if those research questions change significantly, we could reasonably do that rather than holding the document open to see what other research questions pop up. So I don't know if that's a model that would make sense for the for this draft or not, but if it did, that is what we did with the questions draft as well, research questions draft as well. So second thing is, it seems to me that it would be good for, and this is orthogonal to what I just said, terms that we ought to need in PANRG, whether we have a draft of that space or not yet. I don't know how predictive this draft could be about those terms, but I think that even if you, circling back around, even if you did checkpoint this and say, this is the terminology that we're using now, having a BIS draft open for anything that we need to make, as people come up with things that we're looking at, that we, that need terminology that we're not using now. So, and the cool thing is that there are people in line behind me who can explain why I'm wrong. Thank you.
go, Gory.
Thank you for doing this. I do think we should define endpoints, so I will vote for that one. How are we going to help you most to finish this document? Are we going to try and raise some issues in GitHub and discuss each individual term a little bit? Or are we going to do it by a mailing list? Or are we going to just bash it a bit more in our spare time this meeting? How would it best help you to get what you need?
I think GitHub issues are great. I also welcome comments on the mailing list, but usually at some point I turn them into GitHub issues. And yeah, I think right now I would be most curious if people have any suggestions for our existing definitions, because I kind of feel like at some point I want to decide that we're at least done with the definitions that we already have, and then figure out if there is definitions that we are missing, and figure out if we want to checkpoint the draft and then circle back at some point, or whether we want to keep it open. But that's the kind of questions that I'm asking myself. And I guess if you have feedback on a specific property, an issue is probably the best way to go. Email is also fine. And if you have general thoughts on how to sort of determine which other terms we want to define, maybe an email is best, because then we can all discuss it on the PANRG list.
Okay, I mean, can I offer a couple more just to see what happens? End-to-end should be something we can define as a transport people if we take Sabina's input there and really be clear about where we're defining its use. So some of these things are going to be definable, but only if we pin them down. Is that helpful or not?
I would say that if it helps us talk about paths and be clear on what we mean, then yes.
So calling myself from the queue as an individual, I apologize for saying the E word and, throwing us down the sort of the endpoint rabbit hole. Although I still think that it might be useful to talk about sort of like something that is a node that is still considered to have, like, in the whole transport space, right? Like there are certain privileges that we give to endpoints and end-to-end protocols, and usually we use crypto to enforce that, right? Like, so it might be useful to be able to say things about path properties on the near side link closest to an endpoint, and then it might be that the definition of endpoint is the endpoints are the point at this end of the path and this end of the path, and then it's like the context you get for free, right? Like, so depending on which path you're talking about, if the endpoint is always the one at the front end of the path, the back end of the path, you don't have to worry too much about, is that endpoint a tunnel ingress point or an egress point, or is that endpoint an end host, or some sort of proxy or whatever, right? I would tend to agree with sort of like I would tend to agree that the question that you asked earlier should be a statement. How do we know that these definitions are done? I think it might make sense to have, especially on sort of like the big ones, entity, node, host, link, path element, and path. I think the other ones we can maybe talk about a little bit more because they're defined in terms of those. Those we might want to say, hey, we're pretty sure as a research group that this is how we want to say this, because I don't want to get to the point where we, go all the way to the end of some of this traversal of the vocabulary space and then say, oh, a path is actually something subtly different in a way that we need to go and do that again, right? Like, so there's a way to do a research group last call on, bullet points in a subsection of a document. But maybe we should have that discussion on the list. It's like, let's please throw, I think between now and the next meeting, definitely. Okay, let me put my chair hat on. Between now and the next meeting, definitely, please throw as many arrows as you can at the terminology in this document up to path. Like, if you have something there that makes you unhappy, other than the fact that it is necessarily like path is kind of a very long paragraph, and I don't know how you can shorten it. But in terms of things that are missing, please make those suggestions. Let's say before the next meeting, and then we can at least say, okay, well, now the people who've been here and been looking at this document over the past more than a year, or this definition in its current form for the past couple of meeting cycles, there's at least consensus among us that this is probably not wrong. Spencer.
I just pasted something in the queue, but if we're kind of headed down the GitHub spiral in PANRG, which has been helpful for me as a draft author, one of the things that groups like, let's say Quick do, which have a fairly active GitHub repo, is publish weekly summaries of issues and comments and PRs and what got merged and things like that. If any activity happened in the GitHub repos that are being tracked, I put a link to the GitHub repo where those activity reports are maintained, and I found them to be very helpful in the Celery working group I'm chairing, which has an awful lot of stuff going on in GitHub and much less stuff happening on the mailing list. So if it would make people feel better about having conversations in GitHub, there is a fairly easy way to give at least a high-level indication that there are things in the GitHub repo that people should take a look at.
I will.
So I should mention that.
I will go ahead and send that PR to Imnot during this meeting. It's a very easy thing to do.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Like at the very worst, it's like one more email in the inbox per week that things happen on these drafts for PANRG. I think that's like something that we as the research group should provide as a service to the draft authors, and I'm just going to do it.
Fabulous. Thank you.
All right, I think the queue is drained, but we have a whole bunch of time, so I'm going to leave this open for another 5 to 10 seconds or so. See if anybody.
But thank you. This was already useful. Very useful.
And thank you very much for the last update. I like where this document is going.
Sure.
All right, uncomfortable silence over. Thank you very much, Reese. Next up is Nicola. Take it away.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
We can.
Great. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to present this document. We have been working on that for a while, and lots of you may have already heard of this document. I think that for the discussion we just had, the main difference and the main thing that we have done since the last IETF is trying to use the past properties document to describe satellite systems. So we tried to use the terms of host, node, and the different past properties to describe our systems. So this is a talk I do on the behalf of my co-authors. I have a few very small deco slides, so I guess that if you want to interrupt me at any moment, please go ahead. So we have already shown these slides a lot, but basically there were lots of activity in the IETF that concluded in the 2000 when basically TCP features required specific tuning for geo satellite deployment. But that was more than 20 years ago. TCP is much more sophisticated. Now we have BBR that does great on satellite systems, and Cubic has changed a lot too. But also, even though TCP has increased and improved a lot, we still use performance enhancing proxies more for isolating the losses, for example, and do some specific tuning on TCP. We have an issue at the moment is that with quick deployment, things are not that great. It depends on the applications you're looking at. In some cases, quick helps a lot. Sometimes when you have long flows, transfers with losses, it's not that great. Also, what happened since the 2000 is that geo satellites have seen their capacity increasing a lot. In 2010, satellite could transmit 100 gigabytes, and now we are launching satellites that have 500 gigabytes capacity. We have also all heard about the LEO boom that is going on at the moment with Starlink getting deployed. So there are a lot of strange and a huge variety of SATCOM systems that are being deployed, and we think it's very important to describe them all in a document at the IETF. In short, on this slide, we tried to compare GEO and LEO systems. If we focus only on the satellite access network, now we have very high and variable data rate on the GEO systems. The latency is high. We try to improve the speed of light every day, but we struggle in doing so. There is no losses, and basically the LEO satellites has on the whole a lower data rate, but it depends a lot on the amount of LEO satellites that you are launching, and basically the latency is way lower than the one we have in GEO systems. Again, we all in this document have a very GEO background, and we would be very happy to have some feedbacks and experience from users and operators that are more familiar with LEO systems. LEO systems are very strange and very different from one from another, and what Starlink is doing is different from what OneWeb is doing and what Telesat is planning on doing. And we think it's very interesting to everyone to have some sort of document describing all that in the IETF, because it helps if the transport is satellite aware, because satellite system used to broadcast TV only, and now we've seen that the satellite can be just one part of the end-to-end internet path, because this is used a lot for backhauling, for basically trunking, and for lots of users that have been remote working for a while, and some of us are using satellites to do so. Sometimes we use satellites, we don't even know. So satellites are part of the end-to-end system. So the main change, as I said, from the document, it's just something that we have started. It's not over, it's not finished. And basically, we tried to look at the generic satellite system, saying you have the host that has an end service. Then we have lots of nodes and a host at the end. The node B is the point of presence of the SATCOM system. Then we have the satellite, lots of network functions where we have our proxies and firewall. Then we have something that is more really specific to satellites, focusing on MAC and physical layer functionalities. Then we have one or several satellites. We have a node that receives the signal, and then we have the end service. So this is we tried to use the past properties document to describe a generic SATCOM systems, and we have seen that basically there are some parts that would be interesting to discuss, because what would be very interesting for us is to see for the terrestrial part, what are the protocol features that are available, what transport protocols are available, what can we do, and what is the transparency of the path. And then for something that is more satellite centric, we have all these elements that we think is interesting to describe. So lots of them are related to the quality of the signal, and so basically we have done that for one geo system, and we think that we have different solutions for the next step. In general, path awareness helps a lot. Using this document, the PANRG path properties terminology has helped us in trying to better describe our strange systems, because we are not that so strange, and we want to show that to everyone. Awareness of the characteristics of our systems would help protocol designers, and maybe help also all of us to take better decisions on how to design protocols for this use case. Basically, we know that we have just started it to use the PANRG terminology in all the document. This has just been done as an example at the beginning of the document, but we wanted to have a feedback on the group on that, saying, is it interesting to do that? Is it interesting to have this some sort of example on how you use the path properties document? Does it make sense to have that as a document as a research group? So these are the questions we have, and I would be happy to have questions and your feedback on this.
Thank you very much. We already have Reese in the queue. Reese?
Yeah, I read your update on the draft, and I also read the original draft before. And I thought it was really interesting to see the vocabulary of path properties terminology used in this draft. I think it's useful, at least as a sort of a check of how well this terminology works, to be used in other documents, which I hope to see more of. I have a couple of questions or feedback points that I'm going to send via email, because they're sort of going into detail a little too much. But regarding this document, I think it would be really interesting to maybe attempt to answer some of our PANRG research questions. So I'm just looking at the questions document that we're about to publish, and it has questions on discovering, distributing, and trustworthiness of path properties, for example. And I was wondering if we could at least sort of map out the problem space for satellite systems specifically, and maybe take a step at sort of have any of those questions been solved in this satellite context, or are we on track to solve them in this context? And then also maybe for supporting path selection, there's a couple of questions in our questions draft. And I don't think that we are going to write like one document that answers the trustworthiness and discovering path properties for every context, but this is one context in which maybe we can at least get a little further on those questions. So I'm actually imagining maybe having this document and maybe other documents answering part of our research questions for their specific technology and use case. And I think in that context, it could be really useful to PANRG, but I haven't seen any explicit answers to those PANRG research questions in the document. I think it might be a useful addition.
Thank you very much for your feedback. I think this is something I need to check with my co-authors, but we have a very transport-oriented document at the moment, and we think that this can be changed, and indeed having a more using the terminology of PANRG was just a first step of discussing these research questions. The questions we are treating at the moment are very transport-centric, and I think that if it is not only editorial, but trying to provide answers to or at least discuss the research questions in the document, and how the PANRG questions applies to SATCOM systems, I think it's an interesting exercise to do. I have to check with my co-authors, but I guess some of them are here. But I guess this is something we can surely do, and if this is of interest for the group, I mean.
So, chair hat on. I agree with everything that Reese said. I think so. There's a question to me with respect to this document versus like another sort of like wider ranging document of looking at where we are with respect to the context of satellite communications and path awareness, because I think that with satellite communications, path awareness is one of the places where you get the biggest win, right? Like, so just
Exactly.
know you're on a satellite path lets you do so much to make it tolerable. I'm wondering whether, and I don't have an opinion here, whether like that deeper exploration of where we are with the questions is a different document than this document, which is very focused on sort of like the specifics of transport. I noticed that this document right now has a TSVWG label on it. Is it up for adoption in TSVWG, or was it just like that was sort of like the first place to send it?
That is where we discussed it at some point. So this is why we first placed it. That's the first place we send it, and as I said, I think I think that if we end up using the PANRG terminology to describe SATCOM systems, we think it's something useful for the community, and maybe all the transport-specific discussions can be taken out of the document.
Yeah, okay.
There are lots of, there's lots of, the thing is, there's lots of work needed to make it more PANRG-like, because not only describes all the systems using the PANRG terminology, but also assess the research questions, as Teresa mentioned, which we are not doing at all at the moment. And this is, I think, lots of the document that has a lot of editorial work needed in it, and so that's why we also wanted to have your feedback on if this is interesting. We can surely work on something more PANRG for the next IETF. That's what our main discussion point at the moment.
So as an individual contributor, because I don't want to bias the conversation, from the chair, as an individual contributor, I would be very interested in seeing that. There was a comment in the chat earlier where Med had pointed out that seeing a architecture draft in this space would be super useful, and I kind of like suggested, like it would be neat if we like looked at Scion in this way and did like a 5-pager on Scion to say, here are the questions, here are the answers that Scion has. I think that the satellite thing is I don't want to say more interesting, but it's super interesting in that it is an evolutionary architecture as opposed to a revolutionary architecture. It's like, here's how we're bending the internet to fit into this technological space, and I think it would be super useful to see that. Like, I would read that draft twice.
Thank you. Great. So I guess we have lots of work ahead, and we will work on the dated version of the document to have something more PANRG and try to answer the questions, at least discuss answers to the questions. Not sure we have the answers, but at least try to provide them.
I see we have Gory in queue.
Yeah, do you want Gory with his hat? Have my hat? Or without?
Gory with hat, please.
With
I like
hat?
The hat. Yes.
This document is too complicated to make progress in TSVWG recently. It tried to address some need for an update, but really there's two parts. One is defining what a satellite system is and how it is a path through the internet, and the other one is how you fix transport. So I think this needs to be decimated into 2 documents at least. And without a hat, I would love to try and bring the PANRG bit here, because I think it's more useful to define what a satellite system is and what properties it might have and what challenges it might have in a research context than it is to try and take it as an IETF standards document. So as an individual, I would happily destroy my own document and bring the best part of it here, and then see if the other half can be sorted later. Does that help, Brian?
Yes. Okay, I would then say, just from the chair, please do that, right? Like, so, we've had, at least 2 individuals, one of them is myself, but okay, express interest in having that document exist. So So please do it, and we'll go ahead and save you a spot on the agenda next time.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Next up, we have, I closed my agenda to go read the thing. We have Spencer, of course. We have Spencer. Spencer talking about multipath selection strategies coming up.
Do I use your slides or do I use mine, or?
I think you can.
You can try to use uploaded slides if you prefer.
Yeah,
I
there are
think it
like
would be
pre-selected or pre-uploaded slides when you do a share
second
screen.
left, share preloaded
Yeah.
slide next to the
Yeah.
joining the queue.
So I'm asking to share slides and asking to share
Yes.
screen.
No,
Asking to
next
share slides.
next to share screen, there is share preloaded slides.
I don't have that yet.
So find a join the queue button and right to
that one I can find. Yes.
Then there's a field. There's an icon of a file.
I got to ask to share slides.
Yeah, ask to share slides. That one. Yes.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
Fabulous. So, and okay, and I'm doing the path selection. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah. Thank you for the opportunity to learn how to do this. This is kind of an update on where I think I am with path selection strategies, and I hope it's helpful for the research group to be thinking about not only this topic, but the kinds of things that the research group can be doing usefully. Let's see. And so, and I just, okay, cool. Like I say, I'm still finding buttons. My apologies. Yeah. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is where we are on, if you don't have multipath or you even a transport protocol. This was a really interesting conversation that I had some inkling was going to happen, but did happen definitely in the TSV area yesterday, which was Martin Duke pointing out that multipath is everywhere, and that's kind of his quote, not mine. And like, is this taking over the internet, the IETF transport area? Well, it's at least taking over transport area. Recognizing that we have had multipath things like failover in SCTP since the early 2000s. I apologize on behalf of my dogs. But even, with them even experimenting with load sharing and starting in 2010, and we've had multipath TCP as an experimental RFC since 2013. But TSVWG adopted multipath DCCP at the last IETF, and Quick Working Group hummed to adopt multipath quick extensions yesterday. They'll check that on the list, of course, but that's what we do. So my picture of Godzilla is kind of reflecting that, in my opinion, this is becoming more common, that it's becoming more deployable, and that it's becoming more ambitious. I'll talk about those things a little bit later in the talk. So we did this thing on impediments to deployment for path-aware networking technologies. And because the multipath extension for Quick Draft was just hummed for adoption in Quick, I thought it would be interesting to go through maybe a little, summary of my thoughts on that. I want to emphasize that the draft authors, which I am not one of, are the experts. This is the intersection of three individual drafts. I've read all three of the individual drafts, and I've read this one and participated in some of the discussions that they had. But so far, I believe there is one word in the draft that I have contributed. So, like I say, what they were presenting and the links in this the proceedings should be live for people's convenience. They were focusing on core components like negotiation and path management and basic scheduling and packet transmission and retransmission. Okay, that's kind of their scope scoping there, and their design principles were to use as much as possible from the core Quick specification. They are defining a path as a bidirectional four tuple. They are signaling. They are replacing path migration by path simultaneous use, and this is actually sort of where the current discussion or the current draft for SCTP is, where they had the ability to do failover in SCTP. And now they're saying, well, if we have these two perfectly good paths, we could use both of them at the same time. So kind of the same thing going on here. They added one transport parameter to say basically enable multipath. They added two new frames. One is frame abandon, because the way path migration worked, they were moving from one active path to another active path. And they said basically, that the thinking was that they could basically clean up the path that you move away from, which is what you want to do for failover kind of things. It's what you don't want to do if you want to do anything besides failover. They have one remaining decision, whether they use one packet number space or multiple packet number spaces. And that's explained in the decision, that's explained in the draft. And basically, that was not a showstopper for adoption. They don't want to publish it with that option, with that being optional. So remember the lessons learned that we put in the PANRG document on impediments to employment. There's a chart in there that looks like this. I think it's table 1, if I'm remembering correctly. Yeah, table 1, if I'm remembering correctly. So I went through that a little bit, and people can interrupt me and ask questions or even tell me I'm wrong, but this is where I am on this. And it would be okay with me if other people had opinions about this, that especially because they're relevant to active draft in the Quick Working Group. The first thing was, how do you justify deployment? That is something to think about because in Spencer's opinion, that depends on your path selection strategy. It's pretty easy to justify deployment if you're going to be doing load balancing across multiple paths for like a bandwidth bonding, path bonding kind of thing, or something like that. There are path selection strategies that you don't get as much obvious help from, at least not yet. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. The benefit for early adopters. So basically you say, if your path selection strategy would give you benefits, you don't have to wait for other people to adopt it. This is entirely up to the endpoints, and the endpoints can, the endpoints can use this, and if one endpoint doesn't support it, they'll use quick RFC 9000 version. Benefits during partial deployment, and this is actually the network side of, or sorry, the path side of the previous one, which is that's basically saying, do I have to upgrade everything along the path in order for you to get benefits? And as we said, there's nothing that's involved here except the endpoints. So that's, not a problem. The question of whether you can outperform end-to-end protocols, these are the signals used by QUIC, so including multipath QUIC, are end-to-end. We did say, and we talked about this during the QUIC session, you might have the opportunity to do better than end-to-end if you have a good strategy for which path you use for X. And this is one of the things that comes up in satellite. So it's possible for you to beat end-to-end on one path, but it seems like you're not going to get worse most of the time. One of the biggest obstacles that we talked about in RC 9049 was the tension between operators having to upgrade to, or somehow to be actively involved in deploying a new network, a new path-aware technology, but they would want to pay for that. And, so like, you're really balancing the benefits and the costs to operators and to end users. That's not really relevant here because the extensions are encrypted. They're not part of the invariant header. So, which is public. So basically, the operator's decision, the operator's not participating in this at all. So that concern, that impediment doesn't seem to apply. The impact on operational practices. And this is actually kind of interesting because I think in 9049, we were mostly thinking about operational practices within the network. But now that we're talking about a protocol that is, encrypted end-to-end, or heavily encrypted end-to-end, those are not the operational practices that may be involved. We said, it is possible that if you're using QLog now, in operations at an endpoint, you may need to enhance QLog, and you may need to change your operational practices to say what you look at when you're trying to understand what's happening with a connection. But like I say, I think that's minimal. It's certainly not the obstacle that we were thinking of it when we did 9049. The impact on or per connection state. all the connection state is in the endpoints. So again, this is not per connection state for things in the network. So this this is not a change. I can stop here or go to the next slide if people have clarifying questions on this one. And I should probably be watching the queue.
I think there's a bunch of clarifying questions / discussion in the chat. If we want to bring any of that, Mike.
Awesome.
I will let people come to the queue, or we can keep that in the chat.
Yeah.
I think it's, it might be clarifying discussion as opposed to clarifying questions. Let's keep going and pull up
okay.
Comes out of that at the end.
Cool. And I am thinking about a kind of fun thing, just glancing at those. But let's do the next slide. So keeping traffic on fast paths as the traffic goes through along the path, we're not doing any impact on any IP header or extension IP header field. So no reason to drop off the fast paths that I can see. The endpoints trusting midpoints and midpoints trusting endpoints. These additions are encrypted. They're not in invariant fields at all. So none of the signaling is coming from or going to midpoints. So there's no particular reason for trust to be a concern at all. Reacting to distant signals. When we did 9049. Support for reacting to distant signals was a lot about how quickly network elements, intermediaries, could detect something that the let's say a sender needed to know, and our understanding is basically by the time the intermediary could react, the end-to-end signaling is already headed the right direction. So I don't think that's an obstacle at all. There's two things that on this slide that I thought were thinking about. One was support in endpoint stacks. So these are potential user space stacks, and that ought to be a lot less of a concern than support in endpoint stacks has been for path-aware networking technique deployment in the past. Recognizing that scheduling for this is a work in progress, and the slides that were presented yesterday say that. And I think I understand what that means. And the planning for failure, which was, and this was a lesson that was specifically on EPN, on explicit congestion notification, ECN, and basically the problem that when people turned that on and there were problems, and then people fixed the problems, there was no incentive for people to turn it on again to see if they were still going to have problems. I think the only thing like that here is, we recognize, we know that we need to recognize, when I say dysfunction, I mean that I have added paths that aren't helping. So that's people are working on that in the general case. Let me do this. Sorry, I don't click that. I click this. Yeah. This is how this looks to me, and I'm happy to be educated. I think multipath quick looks really good going through the 9049 impediment list, lessons learned list, especially for a -00 individual draft, which is what it is today, recognizing that it's a merge of much more, of mature individual drafts. Out of the 13 lessons learned, 1 plus a half plus a half are only, are worth thinking about. The trust lessons learned, neither one of them are relevant. And those were the big problems. Those were the showstoppers that we didn't know what to do with at all when we did 9049. So that's absolutely awesome. For justifying deployment, like I said, I think that depends on the path selection strategy. And if you're doing bandwidth aggregation, that would be awesome. If you're closely managing redundancy, especially part of the time, that might happen just as well in the application, perhaps. Supported endpoint stacks depends on advanced scheduling, which was explicitly out of scope for the first version of this merge draft. So I'm looking for understanding more about what that means. But that gets me into kind of the path selection talk that I did at the last IETF in PANRG. So, that, like I say, that's something to talk about. Just recognizing that if whatever advanced scheduling means isn't advanced enough, your app will be doing the advanced scheduling. And so if your app is doing that, you're not exploiting what's in an endpoint stack. That I'm not telling you that's wrong. I'm telling you, I'm just going through the checklist. And planning on failure does depend on knowing when to discard paths that aren't helpful. And that's something that people are still working on. I would like to pause for a moment of appreciation, not for me, but for the people that have done the work that has gone into this draft. And after that, I would like to have a conversation. And I should probably be looking to see who's in the queue. So I'll stop looking at that. Okay, cool. Is anybody who was finished typing long enough to come to the mic now? Or these are certainly comments we can talk about on the mailing list. But what you got? Hi, Cyril. Cyril, are you sending? Are you sending audio? I am not hearing Cyril. Is anybody?
So you have to click on both the video and the audio to send. He is sending audio, although it might not be working. We cannot hear you, Cyril.
And if the note taker just says Cyril had questions that may be in the chat, I would know what that means.
Okay, he's going to type his question.
Or if somebody wanted to relay it.
He's going to type his question. I'll relay it.
Okay, cool.
This is the last thing on our agenda other than the open mic, so I think we could take a little time. It sounds like the question is very long. This will be a difficult one for you, Spencer.
Super easy, barely an inconvenience.
So there was a thing that, while we're waiting for Cyril, there was a thing that Matt said in the chat that I just wanted to raise. He pointed out that, like, would not necessarily tag benefits for early adopters is no problem. And I think we should also recognize one of the things that's happened since Quick is that before Quick, we used to think that, like, in the transport space, it was very difficult to deploy any transport protocol because you had to own both endpoints. And then with Quick, you had it, various entities that owned, well, I mean, Google, who owned, the stack on the phone and the global front end, where you could actually do this. And once that happened, once that initial deployment bump hit, other people could leverage off of it, right? Like, as soon as there existed one owned both endpoints deployment, then it's obvious that there's other ways that you can hang off of that. And I'm wondering if that's maybe sort of a meta comment on the what not to do RFC. Is like with Quick, there was first adopter benefit, but it had to be a very specific set of first adopters. But once that happened, there was enormous second adopter benefit. So, I mean, there's a little bit of like a semantic question to happen here. I think I'm just raising this more to wait for Cyril, who has now typed his question. But it's interesting to recognize that, like, the way that we would have phrased that question 10 years ago is a little bit different than what it means right now.
Okay, so let me just say this, because I think you're making a really important point that should be somewhere between this discussion and open mic, which is that we did what not to do because the impediments for deployment there were things that had been impediments for deployment for, in some cases, decades. I think the oldest one that's contributed was one from Gory on ST2. And I mean, there are people on this call who are younger than ST2. But it was still that lesson never went away. We have been asked repeatedly while we were working on the what not to do draft, where's the list of things that we should do? And I'm having gone through the exercise with multipath Quick, I'm wondering if it's time for us to think about producing a document about something in this space. And if the answer is that we are fundamentally changing the way the internet looks at endpoints and in the network as fast as we can, that might be a good thing to recognize. Like I said, I would say about half the things on the list of impediments to deployment are things that shouldn't matter for modern applications using modern transpoints.
Cool. We'll maybe take the rest of that to open mic.
The open mic, yeah, absolutely, yeah, sure.
And I'll relay Cyril's question. Cyril would say that partial deployment heavily depends on the existence of different high-quality paths. If there are no good alternative paths, then there's essentially no benefit for MP Quick.
Right. We've had the note. I've had the conversation sometime this week, and I can't even remember which document or which working group, saying that basically you can't do better than the path. You can't get better get better experiences out of a network than the network can give you. And so but I mean, that's not a trivial observation. It's true, and from my perspective, it's true, and it's true enough to where we're talking about it at the IETF in at least a couple of places. So I think again, that's the kind of thing where the meaning of the impediments may have changed enough to where it's worth looking at where we are now as opposed to where we were when we started work on when we started PANRG in the first place.
So Gory might have something to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Cyril said, but then the question is, what does a high quality path mean? If I'm really searching for robustness because I have a wonderful fiber optic cable, but it keeps somehow breaking, I'm happy to take Nicholas's very low speed, old-fashioned technology, maybe using an ancient satellite system with very high delay, low bandwidth, because it's my backup, and therefore failing over to that is okay. But if I'm looking for bandwidth, that's not a great solution at all. I'd rather not do it. So I really think the scheduling and what you're trying to get out of it makes the biggest difference to what is a high-quality alternative path.
I agree, and I'm looking. I was scanning through the attendee list, looking for Mirya, who seems to. Oh no, there she is. There she is. Excellent, Mirya. Could you do whatever the right length is, commercial for the IAB workshop on measuring user experience that you all talked about at or whatever the title is that you all talked about at the last session in IAB Open?
I could, but I don't know if there's a commercial needed because that workshop was run in September. So there's a commercial for reading the report, which is out right now.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Yes, exactly. Cool. And Mirya, could you put a link to that either in the chat for Gory or in the notes? But I think that this is a really important point to make, which is that I was in the IAB Open session where the workshop was described, and I think they said they had up to 90 people participating. So Wes said he was terrified at the thought. I think it was Wes was terrified at the thought of trying to summarize that, and that's before significant deployment of multipath. So I think that that's going to be a really interesting conversation to have if people from PANRG take a look at that report and try to imagine what that means in our world. So strongly agree with Gory. Yes, strongly agree with
Spencer.
Cyril.
Can I try a part B to the statement to try now to annoy you, which is when we did RSVP, we needed the app to tell us exactly what it wanted from the network, and if only it told us exactly what it wanted, then we could try and give it. But then most apps didn't know what they want. So is the selecting the scheduler and what multipath properties you want something that's very clear to the app and can tell you, or is it one that we should be worried about because the apps won't know what they want?
So on this item here that I've got my cursor on about support and endpoint stacks, one of the things that was involved with that was saying, can the application convey meaningfully what it's trying to do to the, to anything further down. And I mean, this was this was even in the endpoints, right? It's like, can my app tell me, can the app tell something further down that this is a gaming application and really low latency really matters, and or even worse, I've just moved my eyes in an AR application, and so now all of a sudden the definition of what needs to be reliable and what doesn't need to be reliable is getting worse. So yes, I agree with Gory's question that that's a very fascinating thing for us to look at. I should probably have put this one up, because we're starting to get into that territory, but we can go back and leave this one, of course. What else you got? I need to scan back up so where I can see the top of the queue.
Going once.
Okay, cool.
Yes.
How can I help?
Okay, well, here I have a question, not the specific to Quick, but something to compare. For the ATSSS or MPTCP in 5G domain, we're going to have some proxy on the UPF. It's like in the middle to do some aggregation work for MPTCP. Well, for Quick, from your description for the multipath Quick, it seems like everything regarding the multipath will be deployed on the devices. So here, since we have two different strategies, one is put something in between, one is on the end device. I'm not sure. Have you ever compared this type of things? Or, yeah, just to try to get your opinion. It's like, especially for this PAN research group.
So I would say that, and there are people in this research group that know about a lot more than what went into RC 9049. But we didn't have contributions to that draft that asked, that were trying to explain that situation. And part of that is that ATSSS has it's not that old. One of the goals when we started that draft, and this did not turn out to be this did not turn out to be a consideration for all the contributions to the draft, but basically we've been working on path-aware networking for at least a decade. We haven't been able to deploy any of it. So why is that? And so we have not talked about that much in this research group that I can remember. I think you're asking a very useful question here, because one of the possibilities is that if you were trying to do something like 3GPP does with ATSSS, where you have intermediary between the endpoints, that's in that case doing TCP connection aggregation across multiple paths and things like that. If you're trying to do something like that in 5 years, pick a number, but in 5 years, you may be trying to do things with mask intermediate devices, which could also be doing similar kinds of things. given that what's happening is still end to end between the endpoints. But I think that this is a really interesting topic to talk about in PANRG. And Tommy Pauly from Apple talked about their experiences with using MASC for routing at the last PANRG 111 meeting. So, I think that the question you're asking is an important question to ask. And I think PANRG is a good place to ask that question. Thank you for raising it.
Yeah, maybe it's related to the architecture of 5G. Here we have a UPF that can sit in between. Yeah, that is the thing. We have the flexibility. So.
And that's really that. Like I said, that's really the question. I think we kind of, if you go back and look at slides 8 and 9 in this slide deck, you'll see some of the things that we had concerns about with intermediate devices, and as things that impeded deployment. And one of the things for MPTCP was that there were a heck of a lot of servers that knew more about TCP than they knew about MPTCP. So one of the reasons you have that what UPF in 5G is to do the protocol conversion from MPTCP to TCP. And and that made perfect sense in that case. I think what we're saying is that the definition of intermediary devices may be changing in the network that we're looking at as well.
Okay, thank you.
Others? Hey, Brian, how's it going?
Pretty good. It's been a while since I see you.
Fabulous.
Good to see you. So I think I'm going to ask this question maybe as a way of sort of spilling into the open mic section, talking about this. There's a lot of, I think this support and endpoint stacks depending on advanced scheduling. I think that is oh no. I think that is a multipath in this case is sort of a special case of the generalized case of path awareness, right? And I think one of the big issues that we would run into going into the future with respect to the broad vision of this research group is, let us make the endpoints in the internet, which we're not going to define right now, path aware, which we're going to define with PANRG questions -11, which is now available for your consideration as document shepherd. I fixed that during the break. The MP Quick, I think, is going to have is going to be a really interesting testing ground for that advanced scheduling question, right? Because one of the things that is hiding behind the whole side discussion in the chat over here is that the advanced scheduler is different situations call for a different scheduling, right? And I think that to some extent, the deployment of MP Quick is going to be the deployment of the actuation side of path-aware networking before we have sort of the sensing and the awareness side of path-aware networking. And I don't know that there's any question there. I think it's just, I'm not even sure that it's a non-obvious insight, but I'm very excited to see the MP Quick stuff moving forward as a deployable way in the current internet with a deployment model that we know works from Quick to start experimenting with some of the the problems that are going to be sort of like so difficult and detailed in path-aware networking that we didn't even raise them as a question, right? It's like we're all in path-aware networking, we're all about how do we get good information to the endpoint. And we kind of make an assumption the endpoint will be able to use that information properly. And IMPQuick is going to dig into that. So I have nothing to say other than it is an interesting and exciting time to be alive, I guess.
I'm hoping that many of the people that are at this IETF are actually alive, depending on where you are in your sleep patterns. But ignoring that for a second, one of the things that I wanted to say that I couldn't possibly describe in writing right now is discussions that are happening on an IETF mailing list that is for media over quick or MOQ, MOQ. And we had a side meeting earlier this week that was amazing in the number of things that people were thinking about for media. Okay. And I did not dare open my mouth and say anything about multiple paths for any of that discussion. But I mean, this is like here's the gaming, here's the applications where we're ready, here's the applications where we're ready to closely tie our codec processing to our transport processing. There was a paper, it was actually an IETF111 Advanced Networking Research Prize talk called Salsify that talked about things like that as an example. But I mean, I think we're talking about a real food fight coming up over there. And that's going to have a lot to do with what people are trying to do with their internet connections. And the opportunity for multipath to make that better or to make that worse seems like a helpful thing for us to be thinking about, probably in a place like PANRG. And I'm not, like I say, I'm not talking about congestion control particularly at all. ICCRG is a perfectly fine chartered research group for that. I'm talking about everything else that seems to be going on. So, yeah. Chris? I see you in the queue.
Hello.
Hi.
Oh, am I sending? Yes, I am. So I said this in the chat, but Gory said I should say it at the mic. So yeah, so I probably should. It was just thinking aloud about what happens where you have a future world where endpoints, and I think of endpoints as phones because that's what I do. So these phones are multipath quick enabled, and they use it by default, and they are because they're phones, they have two main connections. They've got a Wi-Fi and they've got the cellular network, and they try to use both. And if they do that independently, probably works really well. Except that their Wi-Fi may eventually be using an ISP network that is also multipath, and it's one way that could happen is ATSSS. It's not the only way, but if we assume that the ISP's multipath is something that works with UDP packets, so such as multipath DCCP, then we clearly have a complex set of behaviors that we have to manage. And yeah, Med said that it's we've also got their different entities deciding the steering policies as well. So the chance that they agree is slight. And even if they do agree, I mean, that is, let's say that they both have the same aims, but so they're both trying to maximize throughput, say, and they're both using both paths as much as they can. But in reality, they're both trying to use the radio network in the same way. They're competing with each other. So it's all a bit weird to me, and I don't know what the right answer is. I just know that it's looking like it might need some more thinking about.
I'm almost positive that that's true. Is it helpful, or is it a hostile act? And I'm probably asking Jen and Brian for me to put a link in the chat or in the notes to the draft that we had about ATSSS for the quick interim on multipath that was like 2020, I think. Would that be helpful? I don't want to sell ATSSS here, but when people from the world where endpoints or phones are talking to us, often that's the context that they have that a lot of us don't.
I think I would probably put that on the list, but please do send links to that, because I think there might be some people in this research group, myself included, who have kind of not paid a lot of attention to that, right? So.
Yeah, there are people in this research group who were co-authors with me on that draft. So, there's a real range. Yes, absolutely. The other thing I would say is I am not the whisperer for 3GPP, but I am contributing to discussions about release 18 aspects of ATSSS, and things that are, I mean, these are things that are being openly contributed, so you could go look them up if you're so inclined and know where to look, are proposals which have not been accepted for 3 paths, which might include 2 different Wi-Fi paths, which might include, along with your 5G connection, which might include 2 5G connections along with your Wi-Fi path, and some other combinations there. And so a lot of the complexity there is going to be problems that 3GPP has to solve, because there are because there's a lot of interaction with the core network in 5G. But I think there's, like I say, I think there's, for us to recognize, how did I say this? No, not that one. Yeah, that one. Becoming more common, that this is becoming more common, more deployable, and more ambitious for multipath. And I think I can make that statement not just being a statement about the IETF and not just about the open internet as we understand it. I think that that's true for hyperscaler people who are doing things with multipath, or who can be doing things with multipath inside their networks, even if that's not the open internet. I think that that's definitely true for the 5G people, because it's not, what they're trying to do is not unambitious now. And it looks to me like there are proposals to be more ambitious. So yeah, I think that this is a thing. As far as profitable ways for PANRG researchers to be spending time.
So I have often made, at least twice in Pechakuchas, I have made sort of like the side joke that the easiest way to end a meeting in transport is to yell multipath and run out of the room. I do want to check with other, this is a really interesting conversation. You don't necessarily need to send that link, at least for me, to the list, because I already found the document. Med put the link in the chat a while ago, but it might make sense to send something out to the list for people who are not here who are sort of interested in this. As chair, I did want to make sure that we have, we promised 40 minutes of open mic time. We have 15. I did want to make sure that we don't take all of the time on multipath, because multipath will take all of the time if we want to. So I would say, Spencer, you can stay up here in case people have more questions on this. But I would say if you have anything to raise at the PANRG open mic about, what we're doing, what we should be doing, what we should not be doing, other than apparently a bunch of multipath stuff, and other than looking deeply at satellites, both of which I'm kind of excited about. Now is your opportunity to come to the mic and open that. And if nobody comes for a couple of minutes, I'll open the mic lines back up to people who want to talk about multipath.
And I would observe two things. One is that the satellite thing has a potential multipath aspect as well. So you can run, but you can't hide. And number two, if I wanted to try to end a transport meeting, I would have said multicast.
Yeah, it's even worse. The mic lines are open. There are many and many. It is a multi-mic line. Janji?
Hi. Actually, well, I have a fundamental question regarding the multipath here. So here we're talking about the path aware in the research group. So in order for like a device to determine whether it should go use which path, or even prefer one or the other, or whether select both or even three paths, does the end device have to get some path aware, detect something before it makes decision? If it does not, so why it's called path aware?
So I think that's sort of like, that's a gigantic open question. Right now, the way that all of this works is you either have the endpoint that has two paths and it'll do measurement, right? And it's going to attempt to infer some things about which path is what. And in some cases, it's fairly easy to do that if you know something about the initial network technology. You can say, oh, I'm on a LTE network, or I'm on a 5G network. I'm going to guess some things about that. It's harder to know if you have a satellite in the middle, which is why you basically will have proxies. So endpoints themselves that will essentially retunnel the thing, right? The larger question in path-aware networking is, can we, by adding something beyond just endpoint sensing, so these path properties, and giving that information to the endpoints, wherever those endpoints happen to be, if they're, the user terminal, if it's the front end at a large CDN, or if it's, something in the middle of the network that's doing some tunneling in order to get around something because it knows what that path is. Having a stack that knows how to communicate about that is probably better than having a stack that's going to guess about it, right? Like, so that's, I think the other question you're asking is just, a multi-path thing that's doing measurement path aware. Yeah, I mean, it knows that it's using multiple paths, right? But like, sort of the statement of what we're kind of trying to do here is sort of that first section in the questions document. I don't know. Did that answer the question? I think that's a yes.
I'm not sure you
Spencer.
heard. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, Spencer, go ahead.
I want to be very sympathetic to the last question. One of the things that's popping up for me as I was going through the 9049 checklist with multipath quick was that the meaning of some of the words have changed because the way we're using the network is changing a lot. If you think about the first path aware networking research group, proposed research group meeting that we had, that was like in the that was the beginning of quick charter time, and things like that. And so there were a lot of things that we're taking for granted with the way the network seems to be going now that we were not thinking of then. And we were talking a lot about signaling from endpoints to middle points and from middle points to endpoints. So I think that one of the things that might be helpful would be to flip open your presentation on the IAB review of PANRG and look at what they think we're doing, because I think that there were things in that did not, and I'll stop sharing slides so you can do that. But I think that they were looking for something a little broader than the definition of path awareness that we were using when we had our first meeting. Jen and Brian, is that kind of your memory? But like I say, if you could share that slide from the IAB review deck, because they were kind of thinking about things that they were the way I understood that review was, these are the things that we are hoping that you will continue doing.
Yes.
And that was kind of cool for me.
So yeah, I mean, like, so the three, for a while, I think we were spending a lot of time as sort of the fourth thing on this list, right? Just sort of like a generalized, like we were running through what not to do. We were kind of, continuing to work on questions and keeping it open in case any others came up. I think now we're kind of focusing on sort of like, the research applications of PAM properties, IETF protocols. I think there might be, there was actually a question in TSV area, the TSV area meeting this time about, hey, let me see if Martin is probably not here, because I think that his, no, Martin Duke is not here. I think he's got a
Zahid is.
Zahid is. Yeah. So
put an AD on the spot. That always works.
Feedback to the TSV ADs. It might be because a lot of the interesting things that are happening in multipath are, one, a bit researchy, and two, are very much about path selection, right? Like, so this whole nasty, how many schedulers do you need and how do they need to know what they're doing problem, I think might fit here. So that might be a thing for y'all in transport to consider if you're thinking that there is a need to touch some of the multipath questions in a single venue where everybody's kind of talking at the same time. And Zahed has risen to the challenge of being put on the spot. Zahed.
Yeah, I think we have been discussing these things, right? I mean, multipath, it is not new topic. I mean, we know there are some protocol specific things, and there are some things that could go for any kind of protocol that is doing multipath. Like, I have seen some people was worried that there are too many multipath protocols going to be deployed in the network. So I mean, I think I think me and Martin both agree with this fact. Like we have some research thing needed for multipath, and we also need some protocol specific thing needed to be done in a different working group, existing working group. And we are also thinking about like where is the right place to fix, put all those things that needed to be in the research UA. And obviously there could be one new research group that we can kick in to do all the multipath thing, or we can actually pin it to the existing ones. That's basically some discussion that we need to take, right? I see Colin is there, so it would be good to have his conversation as well. Colin, I would like to listen. What do you think?
I mean, as you say, I think that's a conversation we need to have. I mean, there are certainly a bunch of interesting research questions around multipath, and some of them clearly fall into this, the purview of this group. Some of them may fall into the congestion control side and fit into ICCRG. Some of them may fit somewhere else. And like many of the topics we're hearing about, they scatter across a bunch of groups. And I tend to prefer broad groups, and just accept that things fit in a couple of groups rather than hyper specializing in how well. Let's not have a hyper specialist multipath group unless we're really sure we need it. Let's talk about it in the existing venues where it seems to fit in.
Yeah,
otherwise we end up with a massive little silos, and I'm not sure that's the right approach. But better for percolation of ideas if we have slightly bigger groups covering these topics.
So I would ask a bit of a question here. Like, I think there's two places where we have sort of the right people paying attention to the problems that we're going to run into in multipath that are protocol general. One is here, because we're thinking about the path properties that are useful, with the understanding that for a lot of these scheduling protocols for the next N years, much of what you're going to get back is going to be sensed as opposed to actually communicated to the network. Even if we were wildly successful in saying, okay, here's the new path-aware internet architecture that we're going to move to, the deployment curve, but you still need to have this period of time where these properties need to be sensed. The other one is ICCRG. I think this is probably a conversation we should take offline as opposed to have at the open mic, because this has started a lot of conversation. We have a bunch of people in the queue 3 minutes before we go, but I think we should probably take this to the list, and then also among the chairs of those groups and the ADs have a discussion about what the right thing to say is. I mean, people are going to bring drafts to anywhere anyway, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be a bunch of drafts coming all over the place, and it's a reasonably big problem space, and it certainly overlaps with several groups we have already. It overlaps with things in the IETF. So, yeah, we need to discuss it. I don't think there's going to be one single home for all this work.
Good. Spencer.
So I have in a private email conversation about things that I've said out loud. So one of the things with the multipath quick is that they're using whatever quick does for one path congestion control. Right, so the congestion control is path by path. So please make the congestion control as awesome as you can make it, but that doesn't, the way that multipath quick is using paths, that doesn't impact whether you're multipath or not. So they're going to have a lot of work to do to support multipaths, just making the individual paths work awesomely with that. So the other, another conversation that we did have during TSV area was just the thing about the different multipath groups are solving some of the same problems, like how do you detect failures and things like that. And that is, you can solve that protocol by protocol, but you don't have to. And that's what Martin was saying at the mic, that he was interested in figuring out. So that's probably the last thing he said before the private conversation starts. But the thing on our list about a general venue for IETF adjacent work on the intersection between routing and transport, I think that's been a thing that we've worked at. One of the things was we stopped scheduling PANRG opposite like the routing area. But so I mean, there are things that we've gotten smarter about. But my question is maybe more about if we know that where there is a IETF adjacent venue for IETF adjacent work on the intersection between transport and applications, because that was a lot of what I was getting out of the media over quick discussions, which I will not summarize, but I will point people in the direction of that mailing list and say, stand back. And thank you.
Thank you, Spencer. Sabina has the last word.
Yes, I wanted to just remark to get back on Brian's consideration on when he was answered to Tanji, and and he was you were saying, well, it's okay, you can know which path you can access with your phone, but you have no clue whether there is a satellite link between the two endpoints. And I just wanted to point to a draft, a working group draft that is under IESG review in the auto working group. And this precisely talks about protocol extension that would convey some abstracted information on elements that would sit between the two endpoints of a application path, and that could give you a clue, that could give the application a clue of whether this would be good or not, or in which extent this can impact the performance of the application. And this work may be useful to read for the PANRG, and maybe in the next iteration, I can send the link of this draft, and we'll be happy to make a little presentation about this draft.
Excellent. Please do send the draft to the list. Let's. I'm not sure we'll take this as the chairs as a scheduling request quite yet, because we do have a little bit of time before the next meeting. So please do remind us when the call for presentations comes out.
Yeah, and at least I can just say a couple of sentences on the mailing list.
Yes.
On this draft.
Please do. All right. Thank you all very much. That was PANRG for IETF 112. Thank you to my co-chair, Jen, for staying up until like 6:30 in the morning or whatever it is there in Sydney. And to 5. Thank you so much. And to all of you in all time zones for being with us here. Have a great rest of your IETF, and we will see you at the next PANRG meeting, maybe even in person. Have a great one, everyone. Bye.